I earlier mentioned to you that Japan had invested in Bangladesh in the Matarbari port, right? That port is more or less in its phase one, potentially nearing completion as we talk today. Back in January 2026, the Japanese government said that they'd already invested close to $2 billion in that project. And they are hoping, because this is going to be Bangladesh's very important, very key deep sea port, the idea was that it would at some point handle up to 8,000 TEUs, or it would anchor the Japanese big B initiative, which is the Bay of Bengal initiative, right? So this is a long-term investment. Like I mentioned, it has both economic resilience impact, but also a huge geopolitical impact because the investment is very, very huge. Similarly, you have India's Sagarmala program, right, which has over 250 projects, close to $17 billion invested as of 2026. And the idea is to make sure that the turnaround time at major coastal ports like the Paradeep or Vishakhapatnam is reduced, right? Similarly, you have coastal shipping agreements between India and Bangladesh in some way, once again, to reduce the transit times, to make sure that all of these investments are then reaping results through higher and greater economic activity in the region.
Greetings, listeners, and welcome to our episode of our podcast series, Reimagining the Bay of Bengal, presented by Asian Confluence. And I'm your host, Neeraj. And today we are tracing the vital arteries of connectivity that link the Himalayas to the Bay, exploring how roads, rails, air links, and waterways can transform the region's future. Asian Confluence has established the Center of Bay of Bengal Studies in Shillong to promote research, dialogue, and collaboration on the region's shared future. So in this particular episode, we are exploring how connectivity from the Himalayas to the Bay is connected. As always, we'll unpack this through 5 thought-provoking questions designed to spark clarity and inspire conversation. And today we are joined by Dr. Astha Chadha, who is an associate professor at the College of Asia Pacific Studies, Ritsumukhan Asia Pacific University, Japan. Her research area focuses on South Asian conflicts, Japan-India relation, Indo-Pacific studies, and religion in global politics. She is a Women, Peace and Security Fellow at Pacific Forum, Hawaii, and Communication Chair for the International Studies Association's Religion and International Relations section. She is also the author of Faith and Politics in South Asia, published by Routledge in 2024. Dr. Astha, it's an honor to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neeraj. Likewise, it is so wonderful to be here and having a conversation with you on this very pertinent topic.
Thank you, Dr. Astha. So let's begin with a very realistic snapshot of where things stand today. So my first question to you, how would you assess the current state of transportation and connectivity among the countries of Bay of Bengal today? Over to you.
Right. Well, once again, thank you so much for bringing this topic to the fore, because it is one of those, I would say, topics that is less talked about when we look at the overall security or overall dynamic in the Indo-Pacific. See, when you examine the Bay of Bengal, there are 2 ways of looking at it, right? One could look at it as a maritime space, but then also, if you take a step back, you could look at it as a wider region that is connecting a very landlocked Himalayan region and bringing it together in some way, connecting it to the Bay of Bengal, which in turn connects to the Indian Ocean and then to the wider Indo-Pacific. So the talk I'll do today and the discussion that we'll do today should probably be focusing on how this region has a lot of relevance to the wider region that we understand as the Indo-Pacific. So you asked me about the current state of transportation and connectivity. I mean, again, if we look at it from the perspective of individualistic projects that have been fostered, that have been funded in the region, it gives a very rosy, very positive picture. So we are talking about countries including India, Bangladesh, China, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, Thailand, that all are very much in some way stakeholders in the region in a very, very direct manner. So for instance, let's look at maritime connectivity, right? So you have Bangladesh, and there is a deep sea port, Matarbari port, that was being constructed by Japan and Bangladesh, right? And then you have Japanese policy towards Bay of Bengal, which is the big B. They look at Bay of Bengal as the next industrial growth belt. And this belt is not only inclusive of Bangladesh, this includes all of these countries that I mentioned. So it in some way brings together how countries like India and Japan look at the wider region, right? Similarly, you have India's Sagarmala program, right, which has over 250 projects, close to $17 billion invested as of 2026. And the idea is to make sure that the turnaround time at major coastal ports like the Paradeep or Vishakhapatnam is reduced, right? Similarly, you have coastal shipping agreements between India and Bangladesh in some way, once again, to reduce the transit times, to make sure that all of these investments are then reaping results through higher and greater economic activity in the region. Then you have the land connectivity, projects such as, the Haldiwari Chilahati link, or you have the Bhutan-India railway link that is being constructed. Roadways are being constructed, right, under the South Asia Sub-Regional Economic Cooperation. Some of them are funded by the Asia Development Bank. Then you have Nepal and Bangladesh that are connected through the BBIN, right? Bhutan, Bangladesh, India, and Nepal corridors. So we do have a lot of these projects that like I mentioned, exist in some way, because they're funded by Japan, funded by China, funded by India. So they do exist, which shows that the region is important. But we must also not forget that connectivity is not just about road connectivity and maritime connectivity. In today's times, we are connected also by energy security, right? And so pipelines are being built and have been thought about for a long time in the region. So you have India-Bangladesh Friendship Pipeline that was inaugurated between 2023 and 24. And once again, the idea is that, this should foster greater connectivity in the region, even in terms of energy security. Similarly, electricity is another, let's say it's one of those contentious topics, because not all of these nations within the Bay of Bengal region have equal capacities to provide the required amount of power grids for their economies to run, right? So for instance, in 2026, which is very, very recent, India and Bhutan were reviewing 1020 megawatt project in which India was planning to make sure that it is commissioned early, the transmission happens, and in some way provides to Bhutan and also to the wider region. And then lastly, when we talk about connectivity, there is funding, and then there also has to be a framework in order to understand how exactly these connectivity projects are then linked to a wider vision. And in that comes BIMSTEC. Right. So BIMSTEC Master Plan for Transport Connectivity was launched. And if we remember, the Delhi Declaration very exclusively, very openly mentioned that they were talking about a step-by-step integration plan. And so the idea behind that kind of a strategy was to make sure that this idea of Bay of Bengal connectivity does not stay constrained to Bay of Bengal. It does extend to the landlocked region of Himalayas. It does extend to India's friends in Southeast Asia, and then in a way connects what we look at today as the Bay of Bengal into the wider Indo-Pacific region.
So that's a very clear eye assessment, and there is a lot of progress. But I believe that there is also significant gaps which are there. You have mentioned them very clearly. So now you have also mentioned about connectivity. So connectivity projects that link the Himalayas to the Bay, they carry both economic and geopolitical weight also. So my next question is also framed on that only. So what is the strategic significance and the broader impact of connectivity initiatives linking the Himalayas to the Bay of Bengal?
Thanks, Neeraj. That's an excellent question and kind of a very good segue into where I was trying to go earlier, which is that, there's been a lot written about how China has invested in the region. And I mean, again, let's look at it in a very pragmatic manner. Let's not look at it purely through a lens of India-China competition or a US-China competition in the region. Let's just look at it the way it is. So China had made, in some way, an early move into the region because, mainly several reasons, but mainly two reasons, right? One was because China also wanted in some way to bypass the Malacca Straits, make sure that China is connected to the wider Indian Ocean region, to the Bay of Bengal, through roadways, and then straight into the maritime ports. And, that shows in the way that they have constructed their ports around the region. So China had that objective in mind. And of course, the second objective was to make its strategic presence felt. China looks at itself as a global power, an emerging global power. And one consequence of that is that it needs to create its own network. It can no longer just continue to rely or depend on the networks that have been established in the existing global order. So the strategic significance that you asked me of Himalayas and the Bay of Bengal link can be once again looked at several levels, because countries like China do operate on all of those several levels. And the first one, and I think the most obvious one here, is to change this identity of Himalayas as this landlocked region. Right. We know Nepal and Bhutan are very small countries when you compare it to the rest of the region. They're also landlocked, not just landlocked, but locked between two giants like India and China. And so the idea is, by fostering this connectivity, by allowing these countries to be connected, including to India's northeast, and giving them a direct passageway, a direct sort of a connection with Southeast Asia, with Bay of Bengal nations, you allow these economies also to flow and benefit from whatever prosperity is available in the wider region, right? So we are looking at overcoming this historical and geographical issue of being locked into a space and widening it through making available newer economic opportunities, right? And that holds true actually for India's Northeast as well. For a long time, India's Northeast did not see the kind of development it should have seen, precisely because they were seen as isolated, secluded, and receiving less development because they were landlocked. I mean, there are aspects here, there are historical ones, there are bad economic decisions, but then there are also geographical ones that cannot be overlooked, right? The second, I would say, the strategic significance of the region is precisely the fact that it is untapped. There is a huge economic value chain that can be in some way benefited from, whether it's for China, whether it's for India, and whether it's for countries that are coming from the outside investing into the region, such as Japan, right? So if you just look at the visions of these three countries, if you look at China's BRI, if you look at how China has created, for example, the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, it does show you on the map how they're trying to bypass a lot of the blockages as a result of their geographical presence, trying to overcome, them not being directly connected to the Indian Ocean. Similarly, if you look at India's policy towards Bay of Bengal connectivity and strategic significance, it shows for India, it is very much the strategic backyard where India wants itself to be seen as the key security provider in the region. And for Japan, that is not part of the region very directly. They do have the Bay of Bengal industrial growth belt, right? And there's a reason why they have invested in the Matarbari port. There's a reason why Japan is heavily investing in India's Northeast, right? Since 2017, they were even formed the Japan-India Act East Forum. And then the impact, of course, are visible because Japan, India, China, they don't just operate on high cap investments. They're also going down into the grassroots, creating those living and livelihood opportunities for people in the region so that they're not just constrained in terms of economic activity. Those should also increase. This includes technical cooperation, right? And the third one, which again, I think we should not miss, is the geopolitical balancing that all of these countries are trying to do on their own. And if you look at India-Japan partnership, or if you look at India's own Act East policy, for instance, towards Southeast Asia, towards Bay of Bengal region, its own Bengal policy, the very fact that we have tried in some way, not to replace probably, but at least in a discursive manner, trying to overcome SAARC and go towards BIMSTEC, go towards BBIN and emphasize those, shows that in our geopolitical thinking or in the Japanese geopolitical thinking, how important is the centralization of a region that has so much untapped potential. So I think for all of those reasons, this particular region that you've highlighted, both Himalayas and Bay of Bengal, has a lot of strategic significance.
So that's a very compelling view of how physical links can actually reshape the regional power dynamics. And, several ambitious initiatives are also underway or in the pipeline across multiple domains. So I just want to now, I want you to highlight that some of the major ongoing or the upcoming connectivity projects in the region across road, railway, air or maritime domain. So you have mentioned them, but if anything specific is there, I would want you to highlight.
Absolutely. I mean, see, once again, I'll begin where I left off earlier in order to kind of build the bridge here. So when we're looking at Bay of Bengal and Himalayas, I mean, again, trying to look at them both separately and then together again, there are two kinds of projects that get highlighted in all of those domains that you just mentioned, whether maritime, land, or otherwise. One is the idea of economic resilience for the investors as well as the country that is receiving the investment, right? So you need to build that multiple transit points in these countries. We need to foster trade in these countries. So the projects should very directly address that issue. So if for Nepal and Bhutan being landlocked is an issue, these projects must address it, and that can best be addressed through a better sort of a rail and road project, right? And then eventually connecting them through the maritime domain. If I flip it a little bit, there is another group of projects that might not be aimed directly in the region at generating very short-term and quick profits. Rather, they might be long-drawn projects that might take long to complete because of political issues, because of other pressures, because of maybe even environmental pressures. And yet they are important in the region because they have a geopolitical significance, right? And we are seeing a lot of those projects, for example, under the BRI, do fall in that category. They might not be reaping the benefits yet for China, but they have a lot of strategic significance. Now, from that lens, if we look at some of the examples, as you asked me, let's look at the maritime domain projects, for example. So I earlier mentioned to you that Japan had invested in Bangladesh in the Matarbari port, right? That port is more or less in its phase one, potentially nearing completion as we talk today. In back in January 2026, the Japanese government said that they'd already invested close to $2 billion in that project, and they are hoping, because this is going to be Bangladesh's very important, very key deep sea port, the idea was that it would at some point handle up to 8,000 TEUs, or it would anchor the Japanese big B initiative, which is the Bay of Bengal initiative, right? So this is a long-term investment. Like I mentioned, it has both economic resilience impact, but also a huge geopolitical impact because the investment is very, very huge. Similarly, if you look at India per se, it has its own projects going on in the Andaman and Nicobar. Right, and we have heard in the past of how Japan is investing in the islands to help India lay down the undersea cables. Now, that kind of a project needs a long-term vision. That kind of a project needs proper infrastructure, for which, for example, India in itself is in some way developing. Just to take the discussion back to the maritime domain, India is constructing its own international container terminal transshipment port in the Greater Nicobar. And again, the idea behind that is this is going to take some time. It's still in stage one, but it's aimed at capturing the transshipment traffic, so that not all of it currently gets diverted, right? It crosses the Malacca Strait and then goes straight into the Indian Ocean and then crosses over Sri Lanka and then goes ahead where it has to go. So India is trying to build this, in some way to divert the traffic towards the Greater Nicobar. And the idea eventually is, to take some of this business that's going to Colombo after coming from Singapore and then take it to India again. So once again, there is that strategic thought behind these maritime projects that, of course, they do serve a lot of security objective, but then they must be sustained by enough economic means and enough economic potential. Then we have heard for quite some time about the Sittwe Port in Myanmar, right? And again, the idea was that since this port is already operational as of 2024, it needs to be scaled up further. So it has already reaped some benefits in terms of providing connectivity, but it needs to be made bigger. This port needs to be used more. It's another matter that given the current political situation in Myanmar, this could face some delays. But the project, nevertheless, does hold its own significance when it comes to India trying to, in some way, mark its presence in the region and make sure that its own connectivity takes precedence over using other countries' ports. Similarly, if you look at the road domain, a lot of work has been done in that. And the first one that comes to my mind is the India-Myanmar-Thailand trilateral highway that was built. And the idea was, by building it in sections, they would be able to then make sure that the entire project is complete. Because again, it's a huge investment. The problem again with this project is that it has faced a lot of political delays earlier because of the situation in Thailand and now because of the situation in Myanmar, right? The earlier target was 2020 beginning, and we've already crossed mid 2020. So 20s. So now we are looking at a delayed project, and yet IMT continues to, in some way, fascinate the Indian policymakers' mind because it is, again, one of those very ambitious projects that India was planning to build in the region, and it continues to hold its own significance. Similarly, the connectivity projects within the BBIN Motor Vehicles Act, and the idea was to make sure that, despite all of these hurdles in movement of people and goods, it could at some point get smoothened out. So it's not just maritime connectivity as we were discussing earlier, it's also road connectivity. Something so basic as constructing roads and railways that is very, very important for regions, specifically the one that stays in some way isolated as a result of its geography. And then, since we are talking about rails, I must also mention to you that China, served in Nepal in terms of creating a railway line to ensure that, China and Nepal have seamless connectivity, movement of people, movement of goods, trade continues to happen. So they have their own projects going on in that domain. And since you mentioned, that different domains should be discussed, how about the air domain? That's less talked about, right? So, for instance, if you look at Bhutan, again, I think Bhutan is less in some way connected even when you compare it with Nepal. And in case of Bhutan, there is a planned international airport in Bhutan to support its new administrative regions. But again, we need to then see how they're going to be able to both get it funded. Because it is the lead on this project has been taken up by Bhutan mainly for investment and tourism purposes. And Bhutan needs those to sustain its economy. But the issue is they need this port in order to accommodate larger aircrafts. And they don't have it yet, right? And then similarly, we are hearing about building a new terminal in Bangladesh. And this is, once again, probably potentially could be a partnership between Japan and Bangladesh. Would cost close to $2 billion. And once again, the idea is Bangladesh already has its airports, but if they are able to in some way expand the terminals at the Hazrat Shahjal airport, it would allow more movement of people and goods. So we are looking at, again, like I mentioned, projects, some of them which are, let's say, very directly connected to port-related activity. Unless there's a huge political impact, they usually tend to go faster. And then there are the others that get stuck up, because of money or because of getting enough funding at the right time, such as the airports, as I mentioned. And then somewhere in between that category, I would put the railways and the road projects because they're not as difficult to pull off. Usually less than the money, it's about politics of the region that creates those hurdles. And we are seeing those happen within the BVIN.
So, the kind of examples you have given, they really show that the real momentum and the exciting possibilities which actually could connect rail, roadways and air. So, lot many things are there. But now I'll be, coming to the external players because they also play a very crucial role in turning plans into the reality. So my question is to you that how do you assess the role of foreign investment, particularly from the governments, development agencies, or maybe through the multilateral institution in advancing the regional connectivity?
Sure. I mean, and I must highlight specifically that, in fact, a lot of foreign investment in the region is now a necessity because it's not just about the money. It's also about generating interest. It's also about building stakes, right? And it's also in the larger picture because we don't want to see Bay of Bengal isolated. This is about, again, creating connectivity not just within the region but between regions. And very unfortunately, I would say, given the result of, or given the kind of wars and conflicts we are seeing increasingly that a lot of these strategic theaters are getting connected. So when we talk let's say, for example, we talk in a larger purview of the Middle Eastern theater getting connected to the Indo-Pacific security, Bay of Bengal is right there. It cannot remain isolated, right? And hence, any of the investment that comes into the region comes in with this strategic thought that one, the region is part of a wider vision or a wider geography, and two, stakes need to be built within that region because it has a lot of economic potential. Now, with that in mind, I can surely give you some examples. I mean, the biggest two that come to my mind when we talk about foreign investment, which is government funded, comes through Japan and China. I think would be one of the largest that comes into the region. And we have discussed very briefly earlier about how Japan, mainly through JICA, does all of this funding. And then, of course, China has its own funding vehicles available, basically state-owned. Sometimes might include some other companies, but more or less it is controlled by their state when they make a funding into the region. And then, of course, there's another category of funding that comes into the region, which is, like you mentioned, through multilateral institutions. And those could be either the World Bank, that has had a long history of doing projects in the region. It could also be the ADB, the Asia Development Bank, that has built a legacy now for itself when we talk about funding allocation in the region. And of course, then we have the SASEC, the South Asia Sub-Regional Economic Cooperation, that does in some way, in one way or another, try to arrange funds so as to provide for the region. So, for instance, if you look at how much the Japanese have spent in the region as of 2025, they'd already invested close to $25 billion overall in the entire region, right? And one of the flagship, I would say, initiatives by Japan was in Bangladesh, because for them, Bangladesh is at the heart of their strategy for Bay of Bengal. So the Matarbari port would be pretty much considered the flagship project in that sense. And Japan is looking at, in some way, de-risking in the region. De-risking does not mean isolating any other country. De-risking just simply means creating enough stakes in the region so that, there is no consequence in terms of sovereignty for any nation. There's no consequence for even debt sustainability for any country. And so Japan has its own idea of providing that debt, right? They do a low interest debt. They do a long-term loans. They provide technological assistance. They do employ people from the country that they are investing in rather than bringing in their labor. So that is their style of doing business. On the other hand, you have China that has its own different model. And we've probably, you might have discussed that so much in this wonderful series that you're conducting, where China focuses more on speed and scale. Unlike Japan, that has a lot of focus on maybe taking more time but building the quality infrastructure, China is about speedy investments and making sure that it's larger and big enough in scale. It has the grandeur, right? And then again, China's vision is largely driven, unlike the Japanese one, which is the free and open Indo-Pacific. China's is driven by the Belt and Road Initiative, which is their own idea of creating a maritime as well as a land connectivity in the entire region. And thirdly, for China, it's also about bypassing or making sure that they are not in some way constrained in trade due to any conflict that breaks out in the Malacca Strait. So they need to have their stakes in the region. They need to have their presence in the region. And some of very good Chinese projects that have been maintained in the region are, for instance, in Myanmar. So they do have this project called Kuapku Deep Sea Port, in which they had invested close to $1 billion. And the idea was, once again, by creating a port, by making sure that they, for instance, create tunnels, they create railways, whether it's in Nepal, they create roadways, they are able to create this tunnel network, whether it's in Bangladesh, they are able in some way to ensure that their seamless flow of people, goods continues and services continues, right? China has also, by the way, followed this model because they have unlike the Japanese one that does employ people on the ground, China brings in its own labor. China brings in its own expertise to the country where they're building something, and that is their model. So, of course, you'll see a very different picture when you look at the Chinese projects versus the Japanese ones. And now let's turn a little bit towards the multilateral institutions that you were mentioning earlier. Asia Development Bank, like I mentioned, has had a history in the region in terms of both providing funding for certain big projects, but also in terms of providing loans. So ADB's whole agenda is to make sure that once again, these countries, these smaller countries, are not resource constrained because they cannot pay for it in the short run. Likewise, is the kind of vision that World Bank has, but there's a huge difference here. ADB is mainly funding, majorly a lot of projects, and then of course a little bit of their focus is on funding of, let's say, some daily livelihood related projects or people to people sort of projects, or making sure that the daily economic activities of people are funded. World Bank, on the other hand, has a very different focus. Unlike focusing on trade and connectivity, World Bank is more focused on poverty reduction, making sure that there is a generation of economic activity among people. And hence you will see the kind of projects World Bank has invested in tend to then follow a very European American, or let's say a very Western vision of the region, which is to promote all of these liberal values, to promote democracy, to make sure that people have a voice. They work a lot on the grassroots. But if you look at how World Bank functions, it pretty much in some way does follow that guideline and does seem to toe that vision when it does any projects in the Bay of Bengal or any projects in the Himalayan region.
So that was quite an insightful and comprehensive, how you explained all institutions have actually, played an equal role here, whether it's multilateral or all the regional organization. But now, despite the potential, all these many projects have also faced very serious hurdles. And that also brings to my last question. So, what are the primary challenges, like in developing and operationalizing connectivity corridors in the Bay of Bengal? Do you think any kind of a challenges here?
Yeah, very tough question because there are many. I'll have to struggle to prioritize one over the other. So in no order of significance, but because they're all equally significant, I personally would divide them into two larger categories. One is let's say, a very tangible category. One is very clearly the hard geography of these places and in the kind of infrastructure that is needed. So let's not forget, when we're talking about Himalayan connectivity or trans-Himalayan connectivity flowing into the Bay of Bengal, the two regions have very different needs. What Bangladesh might suffer, what India's Bengal might suffer during the cyclones is not the same as what Nepal, Bhutan, or Tibet might suffer if there were to be a landslide. So their needs are very, very different. One of those regions, within the Bay of Bengal, there might be more hunger and more space for more maritime connectivity through ports. But in the landlocked regions, they need more road connectivity. They need to make sure that even when it is snowing there, their movement of people and goods does not slow down. It does not hamper their economic activity. They're not isolated because of nature. And I would say that is the biggest challenge that exists in terms of merely understanding the region and then coming up with feasibility projects or coming up with ideas so as to how to overcome these challenges, right? So one is created very clearly by this fragile ecology of the region in terms of what kind of infrastructure they need, right? And the second, I would say, would be this issue with multimodal connectivity. And the challenge here is that there is a huge multimodal disconnect. Why am I saying that? Because if you remember when I was talking, for example, about the IMT, the India-Myanmar Thailand connectivity project, it's being built in phases and in pockets. So there are going to be obviously areas where it's faster to build and faster to deliver. And then there are going to be areas as a result of political issues or environmental issues, or just the fact that it needs a very different kind of expertise, or it is a very different geography. You might not be able to deliver the project at the same time. And so what it creates is delays. What it creates is a disconnect. So rather than connectivity, we are forced because of geography, resource constraints, or some political constraints into this multimodal disconnectivity. The second kind of challenge is in terms of non-tariff barriers or the soft infrastructure. For example, I was reading this report by ADB that said that despite India proposing this Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal motor vehicles, the cargo trucks still have to spend hours at some particular border areas. For example, when there were tensions between India and Bangladesh, the cargo trucks were spending hours there. potentially even days there. So that kind of leads to the redundancy of the very project or redundancy of the very idea or the vision. It does not deliver. And I would say that is a huge issue, which also in a way flows into another point of, the lack of harmonization. So unless there is a lot of, coherence in terms of policy amongst all of these participating nations, it's very difficult to make sure that these infrastructures or these soft infrastructure ideas that you have in terms of making sure that the roads are there, the railways are there, we just need to make sure that they pass through without barriers. So until we are able to overcome those barriers, these projects will not deliver. And that is something, unfortunately, we have not been able to overcome so far. Another group of challenges, when I think this would not be a surprise, is the security challenge. We're living in a day and age today where within the Indo-Pacific and beyond, everything is a matter of security. And securitization has become kind of the keyword for all nations, right? So if you look at Myanmar, for example, there is a security issue within Myanmar, but then it's also posing a security issue, whether it's for Bangladesh or it's for neighboring countries like India's northeast. And those outflow of insecurity creates a lot of anxiety and builds a lot of negativity around any kind of projects and investment that a country might want to do. And then a second group that I mentioned to you earlier, and I promised to you earlier I'll discuss, is the one which is difficult to gauge, not because we cannot see it. We see it, we feel it, but the consequences are so long term. They're so long term and they're so long drawn out. And sometimes they also become subject to politicization that it is difficult to pinpoint where they begin and where they end and how do you solve them. And the top of that list for me would be the climate change issue. A lot of these projects in some way are trying to address climate change. So, for example, if you look at the way China has built a lot of ports, or China is building railways, or whether it's tunnel networks or road networks, it is precisely to make sure that if there is a climate issue, if there is movement of people that needs to take place, it could use these corridors. And yet, a lot of these projects are in a way causing ecological imbalance. Land has to be taken away. The very fact that land has to be taken away and redistributed means people are displaced. People are displaced, the whole ecology, the whole cultural aspect of that region changes. When people can no longer practice their livelihood, it is a threat on a lot of levels, right? So it's not just about Himalayas and the melting glaciers or water security issues. Those are hard security issues today when we look at them. They're no longer non-traditional security. I'm talking about day-to-day security, everyday security, which gets ignored time and again because of larger projects or larger visions or larger concerns that a state might have. Similarly, unlike the issue with Himalayan security, which is very closely related to melting ice caps, is the Bay of Bengal, which again has a very fragile ecosystem because it's facing rising sea levels. It is estimated that in the next 50 years, or at least definitely in the next 100 years, a large chunk of these areas that are very close to the coast within the Bay of Bengal region would already have submerged. That is no longer a climate issue. I think that would be an existential issue for people who live there or who practice any kind of livelihood. So once again, climate change has huge consequences, which are difficult maybe to gauge and understand today because some of us might not even live to see them, but they are there and they cannot be ignored. And then, I can put in some more issues there that are very closely tied to what we discussed, such as disaster risk resilience. How many times in a year does Bangladesh or India or Myanmar suffer a cyclone? How many times do our Himalayan countries suffer, let's say, a huge earthquake or a landslide? It has been a recurring issue, right? And yet we have not yet built infrastructure that is resilient enough to solve this. And then we talk about connectivity.
So what a pragmatic look at all these obstacles which you mentioned, just in a form of tangible, non-tangible. It was quite insightful, and we must also overcome for these corridors to deliver their full promise. And I'm very hopeful that definitely we'll reach to some point. So what an insightful discussion, Dr. Astha. Thank you so much for your expert perspective on connecting these corridors from Himalayas to the Bay of Bengal. And to our listeners, we hope that this episode of Reimagining the Bay of Bengal has also deepened your understanding of how better transport links can also reshape the region's future. So stay tuned for more discussions on the forces that shaping this vital area. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Neeraj.